So many books, essays, or documents intended on promoting veganism focus on painting a horrible yet real picture of animal suffering and other negative consequences of animal farming. I'm not going to do that here. Here I'm interested in a dispassionate, rational case for treating non-human animals with respect without relying on appeals to emotion. The logos, essentially, the argument itself. Hello, I'm Harry Crisp and welcome to the Cogitate channel. In this video, I want to present as basic as is possible rational case for being vegan. To do this, I'll use a basic deductive argument. If you're unfamiliar with formal logic and are interested in learning, Crash Course has an excellent introduction, link in the top right corner and in the description. But the basic explanation of deductive arguments is that premises lead to a conclusion. For example, premise 1. Only humans can drive cars. Premise 2, Ben can drive cars. Conclusion, therefore, Ben is a human. This is an example of a valid deductive argument. An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. The way we oppose these arguments is by opposing the premises or finding a fallacy in the argument structure. But if an argument is valid, it means there is no fallacy in the structure, and the only way to debunk it is to go after the premises. If an argument is sound, it means the argument is both valid and has true premises. So the goal is to have sound arguments. So here I'm going to present my deductive argument for being vegan. Premise 1. It's ethically wrong to cause unnecessary suffering. Premise 2. All animals can suffer. Premise 3. Veganism is required to avoid unnecessary animal suffering. Conclusion, therefore, veganism is required to act ethically. If that argument is sound, which I think it is, and you want to act ethically, then you ought to be vegan. And now I'll provide some definitions and address the assumptions in more detail in anticipation of a few objections. In this context, animals is used to add sentient creatures to the mix, such as humans, dogs, cats, cows, pigs, horses, etc. Unless you're a solipsist, I think it's self-evident that at least all mammals and avians are sentient. Quite likely fish and insects to some capacity as well, but I'll be exploring gradients of consciousness in another video, so let's stick with animals here. If you're neither a solipsist nor convinced that animals are sentient, then you must believe that humans are the only sentient animal. To anyone who believes this, I ask, what empirical evidence convinced you of this? If it's religion that led you to believe this, something like God created animals for humans and didn't give them sentience, then why did God create them to exhibit all of the signs of being able to suffer and all of the behaviors of trying to avoid suffering? I can't imagine a good answer to this question and see no other reason to believe that humans are the only sentient animal, so we'll conclude, at least for now, that all animals are sentient. Suffering. Suffering is the antithesis of well-being. Well-being is the prolonged state in which a sentient being desires to experience. Suffering is to be robbed of this state or have unwanted harm inflicted. Some examples are bodily harm, psychological harm, or premature killing. Unnecessary. Necessity, or lack thereof, is an important presupposition. For this argument, a tacit assumption is that eating animal-derived foods is not necessary for human survival. In some places around the world, such as third world countries, this necessity can be different. It is permissible within the tenets of veganism to eat animal-derived foods if your life truly depends on it. But ultimately, in these situations, it would be better if the situation changed so that more options became available. Ethically. I draw a subtle yet significant distinction between the terms moral and ethical. If I had used moral in this context, it would be to ask the listener if they agreed, and the premise would have been true if they did. For example, take this sentence. It's morally wrong to cause unnecessary harm to animals. This statement is true if you agree with it and false if you don't. By this usage of the term moral, morality is subjective and likely leads to moral relativism. Well, you'd need more explanation first, and I'll avoid that rabbit hole today. In contrast to moral, I've used the term ethical, which I believe is more absolute or objective and defined by society or science. So I believe the argument I've put forward to be objectively true, and not vulnerable to subjective relativism. My use of the term ethically might give cause for some people to say I'm falling victim to the is-ought problem or Hume's guillotine. I don't think I am, and I'll explore Hume's guillotine properly in another video. Let me add a peripheral point that I believe. Ethics should be the primary consideration, before frivolous sensory desire, culture, tradition, habit, dietary convenience, etc. Note that I carefully said consideration and not imperative. Even knowing it's unethical for humans to eat other animals doesn't mean there are absolutely no circumstances where it's permissible. But that being said, general life in developed countries are no such circumstances. Now that we have some clear definitions, let's evaluate the argument. Premise 2 should be self-evident, but I put it in there just to be safe. But let's move it into premise 1. So let's make the argument simpler and make it premise 1. It's unethical to cause unnecessary animal suffering. Premise 2. Veganism is required to avoid unnecessary animal suffering. Conclusion. Therefore, veganism is required to act ethically. So if you want to act ethically, then you ought to be vegan. If you want to act ethically is of course an open question. Someone could say, no, they don't want to act ethically. And this is an interesting response, but admitting that would have serious consequences in other contexts. What I mean by veganism is required is that if you adhere to the second part of premise 1 by not causing unnecessary harm to animals, then you are acting in accordance with the tenets of veganism. Whether or not you consider yourself a vegan is irrelevant to the point. So in conclusion, I think most of us do desire to behave ethically, and if you do, I hope you are vegan or are going to go vegan. This is as simple as I can get the deductive argument to be, so what do you think? Is it valid? Is it sound? Do you have any objections? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.